Austin, what's happening, brother?
What's up, dude? How are you?
I'm good, man. I'm good. Uh, thanks for joining me today, man. We are both sitting in our own home instead of, for those who don't know, Austin and I share the same workspace, so we usually
Yeah,
see
we
each
share a
other in.
wall.
We share. That's a very fun. Yeah, we share a wall over at the clinic and gym space, so it's nice to be in our own home, talking shop, doing other things today. So, man, it's nice to catch up.
100%, man. Thanks for having me on. I'm excited for this.
Yeah, and then listen I'm going to call it out right now. For those of you that don't know, Austin has his own podcast too, which we'll make sure we call out at the end too. But he's going to be a great guest because when you run your own podcast, those are the best guests to bring on, man. They know how to run the space.
Dude, you learn how to just flow with the punches, if you will, to keep it on the MMA analogy. Like you give that give and the take because sometimes when you're doing a remote podcast, you don't always pick up on the cues. It's not as easy to get the cues. But once you've done it so long, you're just like, hey, I know when I got to talk. I know when I got to listen. Let's rock.
Oh, fantastic! All right, let's jump into this one. Let's get it rolling. But for those of you that don't know, briefly just talked about how you and I know each other. But let's give a little bit more color here. And I always like to ask you, like, what's your origin story? Because we all have unique ways of getting to where we are. So, what is your origin story into the world of MMA and combat sports?
I got you, dude. So, my origin, kind of like Batman, right? Like it's my origin. I'm from Chicago, wrestled my whole life. So wrestled from the time I was 6 all the way through undergrad. And that's really what got me into working with combat athletes. I saw the healthcare I was getting, and it wasn't bad in any way, shape, or form, but there was something left to be desired, if you will. And I was the perennial. I feel like I'm like every other therapist that goes into this field, where like you got hurt so much as an athlete that you want to help change people. So, my background, I went to from Chicago, did high school. I was in Team Illinois for wrestling, did all that fun stuff, and then I went to UW La Crosse, which is a D3 university out in Wisconsin. We're known for our exercise science and our pre PT, pre Chiro program, which is why I picked it. They also actually, as of last week, now the number one ranked D3 school for wrestling, which was dope. They were number 3 when I was there. So as we go through that, I was there, wrestled, did my exercise science, and I actually was an econ major as well. And then after that, I transitioned. I did my doctorate in chiropractic medicine at Portland, Oregon, at Western States University. I also did my sports med masters at the same time, so I was just taking a crap load of credits, doing my thing. And I was actually a strength coach and a wrestling coach at an MMA gym up there while I was doing school. So it kept me busy, but it also allowed me to kind of practice everything I was learning in school. Follow that up with, all right, the origin story. How did we meet? So I started my business, Warrior Sports Wellness. We'll say, I believe it was November of 2019, so right before COVID. I got involved with MMA and MMA fighters down here while I was on my preceptorship. So I was actually working on a UFC fighter on the table. I had a pretty cool preceptor that his name's Dr. Matt Colby out of Tempe. He allowed me to kind of be the doc. I wasn't just learning, I was actually being the doc and treating, which was dope. And I was working on a guy named Bruno, and he's a little Brazilian cat, and he saw my cauliflower ear, and he's like, "Oh, you wrestle?" And I'm like, "Yeah, dude, I wrestled my whole life, wrestled through college." He's like, "Come train with us." So I went up to a gym called Fight Ready. That gym up, it's one of the main gyms in Phoenix. So there's the MMA lab and Fight Ready. And then at that gym, I got to meet Angel Cejudo and Santino DeFranco and Eddie Cha, who are the coaches over there, and Alan Vyers, who he's not there as much anymore, but he's an amazing boxing coach. And those guys welcomed me in with open arms. I got to be a wrestling coach for a little bit while I wasn't super busy in clinic and start my business. So I've cornered fights. Also the strength side for my undergrad. So I do the strength conditioning for my fighters. And then I do the healthcare for my fighters as well. So I try to hit it from all angles as best I can. And then I met Adam because he joined us in the clinic, what, 2 years ago, my man?
Actually, a year
A
ago, even
year ago.
earlier,
Oh
earlier
shit.
than that, man.
Okay.
Yeah, feels like two
Damn.
though.
It feels like 2, dude. It feels like we've known each other forever. But met him about a year ago then at the clinic that the main gym is called Helix Human Performance. And then we all have our own businesses built into this multidisciplinary setting where everybody kind of focuses on their own little niche in sports performance and sports rehab.
Beautifully put. I appreciate
I got
the
you, dude.
breadth of that too. So that was fantastic. So let's let's double click on the phrase of MMA combat sports. Some people are very familiar with, let's just say, UFC is what we see on TV a lot, but
Mm-hmm.
there's just so much more than to UFC. So for those that are unfamiliar with the world of MMA, can you highlight the different types of, I may be wrong here. I'm going to say combat sports. Like what are
Yeah,
the
no, you're
different
perfect.
what are the different types of combat sports?
So the different types of combat sports, there's a bunch, right? So when I like to break it down of what is MMA or mixed martial arts, I like to break it down to two subsections. There's the grappling sports and the striking sports. The grappling sports are going to consist of wrestling, jiu-jitsu, judo. Um, let's see what else is in there. Sambo, which is out of Russia. That's what Habib was really good at. And then we have a couple like ancillary ones like catch wrestling. But then we have our striking sports, which is going to be Muay Thai, boxing, karate, taekwondo, kickboxing. Anything that we're punching or doing a high velocity movement is typically going to be a striking sport. And then the high force movements are typically going to be our grappling sports. And we like to put all of those disciplines together into what MMA is, which is the sport of mixed martial arts, or what the UFC does.
So the UFC just kind of buckets everything and everyone's allowed to practice with
Exactly.
whatever school, I guess they could say.
Yep. Yeah. So it's you find people that have niches, right? Like there's a guy that's very popular right now that's Alex Bahia. So he's a striking based guy. He's a kickboxer, Muay Thai fighter that has transitioned into MMA very well. He's actually the light heavyweight champ. He was the middleweight champ. His nickname's Poatan, which means stone hands in Brazilian, which is dope. And he's what you would call a specialist. But then we also have our guys like George St. Pierre, who is he was the precursor to this current group of MMA fighters, I would say. He's a generalist. He was really good at everything. He prided himself on being able to, I guess, learn every martial art at its core and then try to implement that into I would say, like, the analogy I always use is like Mario. You ever play Mario Kart, right?
Of course.
All right. So like what I like to talk about with athletes is like there's some people that are specialists. Like if I'm playing Mario Kart and I know it's a really quick course, fast course, I'm gonna pick Yoshi. That dude's just right down the course. He's going fast and really high acceleration. And then you also have like Bowser. If you know it's a course that you got to stay low to the ground and you got to be able to stay within a certain level, but you're too heavy, you don't want to get bumped off. I'm gonna pick Bowser or Donkey Kong because they got more weight. But then you got our generalists. Those are Mario. They're not necessarily great at any one particular thing, but their floor is so high that they can still be special. And that's what George St. Pierre did, where he learned all of those different disciplines at the same rate and was able to implement them in a way that honestly to this day nobody's ever been able to do.
Would you like that name is very familiar to me, and I would say he's probably one of the more popular names or well-known names in the sport of, I'm going to call it in the world of UFC, not necessarily MMA. Let's say world of UFC.
Mm-hmm.
Are there other leaders, pioneers, coaches that you would kind of like point us in the right direction? If like, hey, like these are the people that really kind of laid the groundwork for all of us, or have really upgraded or changed the way the sport is viewed.
Yep. So the first like group of people that really changed combat sports, outside of the traditional like wrestling and stuff like that, but really brought MMA together were the Gracie family. So Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, it's Hoist Gracie, Henry Gracie, Hoyler, all these guys, this family that made Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. One of them was the first champion. So Hoist was the first champion in the UFC. So he was the pioneer, if you will. And then really what made the UFC popular was the Ultimate Fighter show. So what really launched the sport and what saved the company, to be completely honest, because it was losing money, was a title fight on the Ultimate Fighter to get into the UFC between, it was Forrest Griffin and I believe it was Stephan Bonnar. And that was, everybody will remember, if you've watched fighting, they always show clips of it, but it was Forrest Griffin ended up winning the fight. It was a absolute knock him down, drag him out fight that people just love to see. It was like that carnage, that like internal carnage that like everybody that you're innately drawn to. And that's what launched the UFC in and of itself, because that's what brought money to the UFC. It brought eyes, it brought money, it brought TV deals, because it was on Spike, and that's what allowed us to get a little bit more notoriety. And then, George St. Pierre was one of the greatest champions ever because of what he did, where he highlighted all of the different martial arts in a way that nobody else has done. And then when we get into today's day and age, we have our John Joneses, right? Everybody knows John Jones, whether you like him or you hate him. You've heard the stories about John. He's the best to ever walk this earth. He's one of those guys that if you want to talk about somebody that if you lock two people in a room and only one's coming out, I'd put a whole lot of money on John Jones, because that guy, he just gets it. He knows how to, he's a student of the game, and he knows how to implement every tool in his toolbox in an effective way. That's on the fighter side. On the skill side, I would say there was early coaches like a Matt Hume, which I know you had Joel Jameson on the podcast. So Joel worked with Matt at the beginning. His gym was right next to Matt's. So he's worked with like Mighty Mouse. He's worked with, Mighty Mouse is the biggest one, who's I would say number 2 pound for pound ever, Demetrius Johnson. And then Trevor Whitman's a really good example of somebody that's kind of revolutionized the game. But I think honestly, the biggest revolution in MMA recently was the UFC Performance Institute. Once the UFC decided to invest into a place where all of the athletes can get better. If you're on roster, you get to access it for free. So you get food for free, you get strength for free, you get healthcare for free, dietetics, everything. And they started to actually put metrics and put KPIs behind a sport that has so many variables. And what those people at the PI have done, I'm not just saying this because they're my buddies, like they're the top of the line. They're the top of the food chain for what we do, because they get access to all of the best equipment, all the best information, and they're the ones actually writing the protocols that I would use to help my athletes move forward. And since the UFC's come around, I believe it might have been 2018 was when they made the PI. Now there's 3 of them. There's one in Shanghai, the base in Vegas, and then they have one in Mexico City for elevation training. It's completely separated the sport from, oh, this is a bunch of brawlers just going in there and doing like a barroom fight, to no, this is a real sport. Like, we have KPIs. We know how to get better at this now. We know how to weight cut efficiently. We know how to strength train a fighter, whether they're a grappler or a striker. And I would say that's the biggest revolution in the last 10 years is probably the UFC PI.
Wow, there's so many things I want to unpack with you about all that right there. So we're going to put a pin right in that thought first, because before we do that and get into the weeds on things, there was one burning question I had for you, and that is, everything you just did is great to provide us some context to what MMA and UFC is about. But I still imagine, like, someone in your shoes who's lived this space for a long time, there's a lot of misnomers or misrepresentations of what UFC or MMA is. So I would love to just ask the simple question. What do you believe is what is the number one thing you think people misrepresent or misunderstand about the world of MMA?
I think the biggest thing that separates, like, the question I always get asked is like, what separates MMA versus like football, right? And I think the biggest thing is that there's no season. These guys are on 12 months out of the year, because you might get a fight on 3 weeks notice. Like, you have to be ready to be able to perform on, literally, there's guys that, a very common thing, if you're on the outside of the UFC and you're about to get signed, right, and the Contender Series isn't running, or maybe you don't have like a AAA title, is you have a really good record, and you're waiting for your big break to at least make like money that can support yourself, because MMA is a hard sport. A lot of these guys, not even in the UFC, but a lot of these guys outside of the UFC have to work separate jobs, right? They're training 12 months. The good ones, the ones that are dedicated, are training 12 months out of the year because they're waiting for their shot. Like, I have 3 guys in that position right now where they might get called the week of a fight because somebody got hurt the week before and they need to fill that spot so that doesn't drop off the card. So they'll get a call and get a 4-fight UFC contract on a week's notice. So it's worth the risk to go take that fight, because then you have 3 more fights that are there for you. But if you're not training and keeping your weight relatively close and really dedicating to not just being an athlete, but what I love is all of my athletes are also martial artists, because I think those are 2 separate things. There's the athlete, it's the drive, it's the discipline, it's the, I know what I have to do to be successful. But then there's the martial artist, it's the respect, it's the actual, we'll say, interest for learning, which not every athlete has, right? If you can have both the martial arts and the martial artist and the athlete, then you can step in and be successful. And that's the difference, I would say, from the outside looking in between normal ball sports and mixed martial arts and combat sports, is you also have to, you have to be on at all points in time, because if you're not, you're going to miss an opportunity, and that's just going to pass you by.
Let's zoom in on that aspect there of needing to be ready. And was one of the questions I wanted to get to was understanding, quote unquote, a training cycle at some point. But it seems like that may be the wrong question to ask. Maybe the right question to ask is, what does from a really high level view, maybe 10,000 feet, let's zoom out here. What does, say, a 12-month calendar look like for an MMA fighter?
I break it down into floors and ceilings, like for what they get to focus on, right? I would say the 12-month view from a training perspective, they're probably going to be training for anywhere between 2 to 3 fights. If you're in the UFC, if you're outside of the UFC, you're probably training for 4 to 5 fights, because you're just trying to get fights under your belt. And then when I break it down even a little bit further than that, it's when can I focus on what I'm bad at, and when can I focus on what I'm good at? So can I raise my floors up, like trying to become a little bit better version of Mario? Or when do I need to specialize? When do I need to turn into Yoshi? When do I need to turn into Donkey Kong? And that's about if we're looking on floors versus ceilings, we're probably about 7 to 8 months of training our floors, trying to become a more all-around better athlete. And then we're looking at anywhere between 4 to 5 months of in-camp work, which is when we're trying to raise our ceilings and highlight what makes us special. From the lifestyle perspective, it depends on where you're at, right? If you're outside of the UFC, you have to manage being able to pay your bills with also making $1,500 for a fight, right? Sometimes these guys are going through 12-week camp for an AAA title that's only going to pay them $1,500 to $2,000. So that's not enough to pay your coach or coaches, pay your manager, and also pay your cost of living, right? That's just not possible. So these guys have to manage all of that on top of finding a job that supports their lifestyle too. When you're in the UFC, or at least on your second contract in the UFC, first contract's a little bit iffy. Some guys can if you're out of America, you can make it work a little bit better than if you're in America, just cost of living. Then those guys, their 12-month plan looks a little bit different, because then they can hit the extra work. They have a little bit more time because they can support themselves better to be able to hit the extra runs where we're doing low and slow 3 to 4 times a week, which I don't necessarily recommend, but a lot of fighters like to do. They like that extra work. They're grinders. So, hey, as long as you're not destroying your body, go for it, dude. Like, as long as you're on a bike doing it, I don't care. And I don't give a shit. Like, do your thing. Like, if that's what makes you happy, if that's the worst thing you do, go for it. But when you're in the elite promotions, the UFC, the PFL, I would consider one championship, and then there's a new one called the GFL that just came out that's paying some guys some good money. Then they get a little bit more lenience on their 12-month plan because they have more time to be able to operate.
When you said, I've never actually looked this up, and I'm kicking myself in the pants for not doing it beforehand. Financial compensation. I heard you say contracts. I heard you say, yeah, this league's paying a little bit more. Let's just go with first contract, entry level. You get your first UFC contract. What approximately does that look like?
It's rough. It's so if you get signed to the UFC, it's your first fight, unless you have a lot of, following matters, right? But the base contract for MMA for the UFC is going to be $12,000 to make weight, and then $12,000 if you win the fight. So you only get half your paycheck if you lose. So and then you can also get a performance bonus. Say you go in there, you stun somebody, you do a really cool knockout, you get a $50K bonus, right? But if you lose that fight on your first contract, then you only leave with $12,000. You got to pay 10% to management, you got to pay 10% to your coaches, and then you have all of and that's pre-tax. So you're probably only walking away with, after taxes, 6.5.
Yeah, not that
it's
much.
rough.
Okay.
It's rough, dude. It's a different sport compared, and that's honestly why I love working with them, because the ones that want to be great, they know how to live to fulfill that lifestyle, right? They know they're going to do everything it takes, and they're going to invest in, and they're okay with having I talk about like, just like us with like being younger business owners, right? Like you got to be able to withstand the suck to be able to get to where you want to be. And it's something I dealt with being a combat athlete or a wrestler my whole life. Like there's a lot of suck for not a lot of reward as a wrestler. Like you don't get the praise. Like you're going the same season as basketball. Like I didn't even get to put my name on the freaking rock when I went downstate. I was so pissed when I was a senior in high school. I was so pissed. But like you don't get the same praise, right? But because of that, it drives you even further. And that's why these athletes are so special to work with, because there's not a lot of financial reward to do this. They are doing it for a paycheck, but they're really doing it for the glory of, damn, I'm really good at this and I've invested a lot of time into this and I want to show that I'm the best and that my work matters. And it's a cool thing when you see somebody really invest and get to where they want to be.
I imagine those are the ones we all want to work with. The ones like, yeah, I'm just intrinsically motivated. Like I'm good. Like I'm just going to do whatever you say. Like I'm here for it. I'm the ones you almost have to like pull the reins back on.
Dude, so much easier to work with those.
As you were describing it, like the analogy that came to mind is like, when the sport of CrossFit kind of hit a boom back in, let's say, like the early 2000s, even like into the 2010s. There was a business model of, if you were a physical therapist, just open up a table inside of a CrossFit gym, because they're going to get banged up, but they're also super motivated to get back and competing at CrossFit games. So it's almost like those are the best clients. So it was like, yeah, like your shoulder's trashed right now,
yep.
But like you're trying to compete in games, a competition in 2 weeks. Like, okay, cool. Like, what are we going to do? Like, those are the ones that, really just want to push themselves and do what you ask. So that's like, as you were describing it, like, oh, this sounds familiar. Why does this sound familiar? Ah, there it is. Like I've had from friends and go into that space and just say the same thing. It's like, man, they just want to get better. Like they're the best. They're the best clients.
Well, the CrossFit gym PT model is very similar to my model, right? Where I work with most of the people I work with are pros, but it used to be like a 90-10 split. Now it's like a 75-25 split, where you want to be able to work with pros, you want to be able to make a difference, but then you also have recreational jiu-jitsu, is, I call it all the time, it's the new CrossFit. It's a community driven fitness event is what it is. You get to build a community of people that really, they're sweating together, they're bleeding together. Like all they want to do is spend time with each other, right? Like you get obsessed with jiu-jitsu. And all they want to do is get back on the mat because it's their happy place. It's their happy place, and it's their family that they've chosen. So that's one of the coolest thing about combat sports, because I would say it even goes a step further than CrossFit, because like CrossFit, you're all working out together, you're suffering together, right? That's cool. But there's something different about being able to like actually suffer from physicality. And somebody like one of my buddies just choked me out, and now I'm going to try to go get them back. And it's just a give and a take. And at the end, y'all slap hands, you smile, and you guys give each other a hug. Like that's something special, and it drives a really cool community as long as it's fostered in the correct way.
There's just something unique about hearing someone say like, yeah, I just got choked out and I'm going to go back and get it and go back for more, Dude, there's just not only that, and then it didn't slip past me that, you hear the expression, oh, like, blood, sweat, and tears, but no one really bleeds all that much in what we all say. But like, you truly are like, no, like we share the blood, we share the sweat. Like that is like a real thing that y'all endure. And I imagine the community aspect behind it is surreal. And then there's also just like, listen, my wife's a therapist, and there's also just a part of me on my shoulder. I always have my wife in my ear, like thinking like the therapy hat on. I'm thinking there's got to be something about this like community that just loves like taking out their anger into somebody else and like not get in trouble for it.
Dude, like my wife jokes with me, right? So in the next year, I'll be getting my own spot, right? We've talked about this, but so I'll have my own spot in the next year. And I'm going to put wrestling mats in. And honestly, one of the biggest drivers, I mean, at the end, I joke with my fighters all the time, like, it's not for you, it's for me. Like, I'm selfish. Like, my wife told me I'm a happier person when I'm wrestling. It's like, you're not bad. You're not bad now. Like, you're a great dad. You're a great husband. But like, there's something different when you're wrestling. You're more calm throughout your day. And it's that physical aggression that you can't just get with a hard workout. It's the give and the take of being able to do something that it doesn't just like stress your muscles out, but it puts you in a little bit of danger that allows everybody to be a little bit more calm, but then also B, it teaches a certain level of discipline and respect. Like when I joke around with like the difference between combat athletes and the other professional athletes that I work with is my most dangerous people I work with are also the softest and biggest teddy bears. Like they are. Like they're the types of people that I want around my kids, because I know at the end of the day, they're actually an amazing human being because they got taught discipline. They got taught respect. They know that even though they're the hardest person there, they don't need to flex that muscle. There's no bravado when they go through. It's a cool part of the culture that I feel like that's another thing a lot of people from the outside looking in don't understand. They're just like, oh, these guys are just grabbing each other in pajamas if you're doing jiu-jitsu, or oh, like wrestling. The joke is always wrestling. It's like, oh, they're just grabbing each other in spandex. I'm like, yeah, I mean, it's kind of comfy. Like, you ever try to singlet? They're great. But also it's like, it's not even about that. It's I know what I can do if I ever got into a bad situation. And because of that, I don't ever have to flex that to somebody. So it gives you a sense of calm throughout the rest of your life, because you know if shit hits the fan, you're probably going to be good.
That's so true. Wow. Yeah, I definitely have heard and have said it myself. It's like, that dude I would not want to mess with. But you're right. Like they don't need to flex that. Just like, it's almost like, like they know. So they're like, that in itself is the biggest
Exactly.
scare
It's the biggest
tactic.
deterrent. Cauliflower ear is the biggest deterrent in my life. I just walk around with it and I'm just like, nobody steps. They're like, oh, it's fine. We're good to go.
All right, now I want to piggyback here. I said we put a pin in it, and I want to double back on it. Is you started getting into the PI. That for those again unfamiliar with the PI, it's UFC's Performance Institute, which has some great people there that are putting in a lot of good work. And you alluded to, hey, started to put protocols, started to put KPIs, right? Like we in the performance space, rehab space, we're all chasing KPIs and plans to ultimately help the people around us get better, right? That is our job, serving them to get better, whatever what they're doing. What I really want to get into the weeds on here with you is just going there with you and just asking the question, what are some of those KPIs that the PI is putting out? And kind of on the back end of that, how are we utilizing those to upgrade, or I want to say change. Yeah, let's just go with upgrade traditional thinking when it comes to training and rehab.
For sure. So let's start it back, right? What MMA used to be. So MMA used to be honestly a sport of a lot of charlatans in the strength and conditioning space, right? It was whatever would make you tougher is what we need to do from the strength and conditioning side. It wasn't really strength and conditioning. It was purely conditioning, and it was just work harder, not smarter. What the PI brought in place was that we should have protocols. One of their big tests is like an isometric mid-thigh pull. They use the same vault system you got over at Helix, and they put normalized data in there for developing force. They've also kind of used the VO2 max and modified it they do their VO2 max on the air bike, and they've made a separate test for upper body endurance versus lower body endurance while tracking in the VO or with the actual headset on, and being able to use those metrics for, say, a fighter is a striker versus a grappler. One of the biggest things with MMA is lactate accumulation and lactate fatigue. If you're in a heavy grappling exchange, your arms get heavy, they get stuck. You can't really move them as well. And then trying to punch after grappling for 3 minutes is literally just a losing battle. So when we talk about the UFC PIs, their KPIs they've built in, one of their main ones is going to be, they have a few different energy system development tests. One of the ones that I use in my clinic it's a 6 second on, 30 second off air bike test. We do 10 sprints through that. So we're getting our alactic burst. We're trying to track what is their wattage, what's their power output as it goes. But then we're doing that over the course of 10 different reps. So we're starting to see the fatigue metrics built in. So we're trying to get that 6 second burst up to the highest level possible for the first 1 to 2 goes. Because everybody knows like the first one's probably shit, right? Like the second one's probably going to be our top one because they've started to accumulate to the bike and they're starting to get comfortable with the bike. But then we start to see the fatigue drop off of when we're trying to hit peak power over and over and over again. And one of their numbers is we want to keep that number ideally under 30, but the elite athletes are keeping that under a 20 to 25% drop off between your first rep to your last rep. And this obviously it's different between weight classes, right? Like the smaller guys, they're able to explode at a more consistent rate. versus our heavyweight, they're going to have a little bit more of a drop off. So that's another thing, without going on too far of a tangent, that the PI does really well, is that all of their data is normalized to each weight class. So they have what's considered to be good, what's considered to be great, and then what's considered to be elite, because they've tested almost every athlete on roster at this point. And they know what each person in each division or each weight class is great at and what separates them. Now bringing it back, then we have our strength tests. Oh, yep, I got you.
You did. Before we go into strength, there was you, as you were talking, there was a point that both you and another mutual colleague of ours who's been our guest on my show before, is Andrew Hauser.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard you and Andrew. Yeah, I've heard you and Andrew talk to me about when it comes to heart rate zone training.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, something that's been popularized by a lot of different coaches and a lot of different sports. A bountiful amount of research and resources on it. Even got mainstream influencers talking about zone 2 training has been crazed the last 2-3 years, right? But the one thing you and Andrew have educated me on, and I want to go there because I found it so fascinating when you guys talked about it, is the zones change based on the modality that you're using. Mm-hmm. So for example, when we talk about zone 2 or zone 3, right? Your cardiac output, you're trying to build up your aerobic base, just trying to accumulate that volume in order to make your structural adaptations, right? I've heard both of you say, hey, when you're running, it's probably X. But when you're on a bike, because you lose the eccentric activity, it's mostly concentric, it probably drops down. I'm going to throw a number because this is what I remember, 10 beats per minute. So if let's say your zone,
it's about 10 beats.
So if your zone 2 in running is, 140, if you're on a bike, it's 130. While we're in this space talking about KPIs and talking about training programs, I would love to understand a little bit more about that point. So the question I want to ask is, how does the modality of exercise change our heart rate zones when it comes to training?
I like to break it down to it's all about the physiologic stress that you put on the system. Right? If I'm including an eccentric phase in the movement, that's going to be more stressful on the body. That's going to cause more blood to have to be pumped through. And there's more nutrients that have to go to assist with bringing oxygen to the tissue, increasing the oxygen transfer through the different areas of the body, right? So if we know that a bike is only a concentric phase versus a running is going to be concentric eccentric phase, that's more metabolically demanding. So as we go into that exercise, we know that the harder you have to push in the given modality. So, and then another one is like swimming, right? Swimming is even though it's less of an impact on the system, you're doing more to get it. So swimming actually bumps it up. So swimming would be another 10 beats per minute up, I believe is what the PI handbook is saying. And it's because it's more metabolically demanding with the upper body as well, not just the lower body. But what I would say is typically the more you have to use throughout the system, the more the heart rate would have to be up. So actually swimming is going to be very upper body and lower body intensive. So the beat per minute is going to be, instead of 140, 150. Running, it's lower body heavily intensive. We get that concentric eccentric phase, but we're also getting the upper body moving as well. That's going to be our base rate of, we'll say 140. But then also when we add the bike in, when we take the concentric or the eccentric phase out, and it's mostly lower body with a little bit of upper body, then that's why we're dropping down, because we're using less areas of the body. When we're using less areas of the body, we can get a similar result. That's how I would break it down.
And so where I was going with this is all of those modalities are ways we commonly program to accumulate fitness, to accumulate that low intensity, long duration, low and slow, some people might like to call it, side of the fitness continuum. And what I'm hearing
I call it LSD running, because you got to be on LSD to make it interesting.
Oh, that's awesome. Man, now I just lost my train of thought with the LSD comment.
I got you.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing you say, and I think this is like, it has changed my thought, or just not changed my thought, but has forced me to ask the question, when it comes to providing heart rate zone training and alongside a certain modality, we have to recognize that those zones are going to change based on the modality that we use. Is that correct?
100%. Yep. That's one of the biggest things with my athletes that I need them to. That was something that I failed to program in and failed to understand at the beginning of my career, where I would have guys just go do like hikes for their zone 2. And sometimes they're like doing incline hikes, they can get up to a certain level. But because it wasn't as metabolically demanding, even though they can hit a certain heart rate, the intensity with which they were doing on the muscular system, they weren't getting the same result that I was getting from the guys that were doing road work. And now I'll be real honest with you. I don't necessarily understand the entire complexity of why that was, because we're hitting the same heart rate, right? So it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. But I believe it was something to have to do with, we're not as in a hike versus a run, we're not using the upper body as much. So we're not having to use that area as much. So it's actually pulling us out of our zone 2 and putting us into more of a, like a, even if it's walking, we're just using the legs. We're actually, if we're hitting 140, we're out of that fat burning zone, if you will. So we're not staying in that steady state with what we're doing. They're probably working too hard instead of the right level of hard for heart rate training. And that instead of hitting the right level of hard, we're training a different adaptation than what we were going to initially try to train, which actually takes away from what we're doing. We're putting more physiologic stress in the system, and that increase in physiologic stress in the system causes them to probably not be overtrained, but causes them to have a different response, because it's all just a set principle. You're going to adapt. You're going to specific adaptations to the imposed demands. If I give an imposed demand that wasn't necessarily in line with what I was looking for, then I'm going to get a different adaptation that I wasn't looking for.
Said principle is so underrated.
Dude, I use it in everything. It's the base. I use it in everything in life. Like all of life can be brought back to the set principle. You're going to get the adaptation that you impose the demands upon. That's it.
Love it. So to recap this segment of the discussion on KPIs here, what we really want to hit home here is that if we're going to do heart rate zone training, the modality matters. And the modality, we're saying, let's just say the more of your body that you're using throughout the activity, the higher that heart rate zone needs to shift. Let's just say plus or minus 10 beats. And that would make, like you said, a great example was the swimming. Then you have cycling. Then you're on the lower end of that spectrum. You have cycling. And I'm specifically saying cycling because I imagine if we were to talk about like what you see in common gyms, the assault bike, that probably fits in the middle space alongside running. Yep. What I'm going to assume here is how to break down those 4 modalities. Let's just say traditionally zone 2. When we say zone 2, that's 60 to 70% of your age predicted max heart rate. Let's just use easy math here. If your age predicted max heart rate is 200, you're 20 years old, 200 your max heart rate, your 60% threshold is going to be 120, and your 70% threshold is going to be 140. Well, what we're saying here is if you're swimming, that's probably maybe 130 to 150. If you're biking, maybe that's 110 to 130. Is my understanding? Are we online here?
So much more succinct than what I said. You killed
that. Hey, I was good at listening, man. You delivered all the information. I was just listening, and I wanted to make sure I was understanding this correctly because I think it's important, right? I think it's it's not a paradigm shift; it's a paradigm upgrade because you go in on ChatGPT or you go in on Google and say, "Hey, I want to do heart rate zone training." Okay, here's my age. Here's my if you know your resting heart rate, even better. Okay, cool. Just based on percentages alone. That's what most of us are taught, and that's what most of us do. And now here, when I started hearing you and Andrew talk about this, I was like, whoa, wait, hold on. And then as you start to think about it more, you chew on it, listening to you talk about it again, here I was like, yep, makes total sense. Like it just makes sense physiologically. If I'm going to use more of my body to make this adaptation, I probably have to accept that my heart rate may be higher or lower in those specific zones.
100%. And one more thing on all that too, because I think it's something that I'm passionate about is it doesn't matter what modality you pick, right? Like it's something in my sport that's I don't know if it's the same way in basketball or soccer, but a lot of people are so locked in, you have to do road work, right? But say you've wrestled since you were 6, like your boy, like my knees are shot, right? Like it doesn't matter what modality you pick. Typically, I want you to do the least impact modality possible because a very common thing for MMA fighters is they're doing 2 to 3 sessions a day. So that's where, as long as we understand how you need to change the variables, then we can get the same response by doing it at a much lower impact if we're only doing, say, cycling, for example, because we're only getting the concentric phase. It's not going to be as hard on the body as if we're doing a run, and we can actually load them, or train them in a way that's more desirable if we're doing it for a recovery purpose or if we're doing it for a zone 2 or cardiac output purpose, where you don't need to just run. Because some guys or do the stair stepper. That's another huge one in MMA, is do the stair stepper, which I love, but not when a guy is doing, if I'm doing my math rightly, 6 days a week, 2 to 3, anywhere between 12 to 18 sessions in a week.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That's where you want to minimize it. And that's the beauty of like the idea of cross training is, okay, find the modality that offsets what you're already doing. So you were about to, before I politely interrupted you here, you were about to jump into the next, I would say, next layer to any training program, and that is strength. And you're about to, I've heard you say isometric mid thigh pull. For those that are unfamiliar with a short expression with IMTP, you're standing on force plates. You have a bar that is at your middle of your thigh to standardize it to every person's body shape and arm length. And then you're pulling up on the bar and creating downward force into the force plates. And we measure the force output. So very common test that is utilized across elite sports, IMTP. And hopefully I think it's getting more testing like that is transcending more into general clinics like the spaces you and I work at, but even PT clinics, because of accessibility technology is getting better. So before I totally hijack your conversation, you're part of this conversation on strength and how is it valuable. I just felt it was important to highlight what that test was because not everybody's familiar with it.
Oh, yeah.
So let's lead into that, right? You did a great job giving us some KPIs and things to train relative to the conditioning side. Let's go to the next big bucket, that being strength.
I got you, dude. So IMTP that's one of my favorite tests. And because you can do it for two different things, right? You can do it on the strength side or the force output side of how much force can they actually generate, right? But then you can also see when they start to drop off from an endurance standpoint. So if you do a prolonged IMTP, you can see when the force starts to waver, which in my sport where it's grappling, that's extremely important. So we know how long can they hold, say, a max contraction for. This is where we start getting into using VBTs or velocity-based training devices. One of the major tests that the PI, they used to do a landmine throw. They've actually modified that to where they do a half-kneeling jammer arm throw instead. The standard old school test was just you're sitting down and you're going to do a med ball chest pass with a certain amount of weight, right? You're going to throw it as far as you can. And that's good, but if I can add a VBT, that's a device that tracks the velocity with which you're doing any movement, and there's different ranges that you want to hit, I can start to normalize that data a little bit better than just taking a tape measure and measuring where it goes. Now, don't get me wrong. That's a great upper body test if you're lacking resources or if you're just doing it at a park, for example. You just got to get some testing done. Cool. Because at the end of the day, KPIs are whatever you standardize, right? There's certain KPIs for specific sports, but as long as you're hitting, we'll say a upper body power metric, upper body strength, upper body endurance, lower body power, lower body strength, lower body endurance, and then a couple conditioning and tests, and you can show that your athletes are getting better at them, that's really all you need. That's what makes a good coach, is being able to play with the variables and make sure that your athletes are getting better and actually assessing the athlete, which I don't think enough coaches really do. Where you can just see where these athletes can get better at without just looking at performance. But bringing it back, the half kneeling jammer arm throw is one of their favorites. They're going to do an RSI, and they're going to do a depth drop on force plates. That's another one that they do really well. One that I like to throw in is repeat contact times on the ground. So if you watch MMA, there's certain athletes that I call them bouncy versus plotty. Some athletes, like wrestlers, are plot and trot. They keep their feet planted. They're just going to walk forward and walk through people and try to get to their takedown. Some athletes, typically the lighter athletes, they bounce through the entire fight. They need to be able to have that repeat elastic effect. So one of the tests I do with my OVR, it's like a little jump tracker, is I'll just have them go through 30 jumps, 30 pogo hops, and we're going to do a single leg and double leg, and we're going to track how many contact times does it take before they start to have a drop off. And I want to make sure that their drop off is, and it tracks time, right? So how fast you're able to get off the ground. So I want to make sure that their drop off is going to be less than 15% through those 30 drops. And typically I want them, if you're elite, to be right around that 10% barrier. Because if you're at 125er, you have a title fight, which is 25 minutes. and you're a bouncy guy or you're a striker, if you start to slow down, you're not getting in and out of your exchanges at the same rate. If you're not getting in and out of your exchanges at the same rate, either you're going to get clipped and you might get knocked out, or if somebody's a plotter where they're just going to walk you down, they're going to grab you and you cannot move anymore. So you're relying on your elusiveness to be able to get away from that exchange. If you lose the ability to be elusive, you're going to get caught up with. So that's one of the tests that I like to do at the clinic, to where we can show some sort of metric to be able to show a decrease or increase in bounce ability in an endurance setting.
Bounce ability, that's a new one.
I know. I like it. I'm just making up words today.
So you did a great job highlighting the fitness side, the strength side. I love the idea of the bounce ability, right? That might also be more commonly known as the RSI, reactive strength index.
I like bounce ability. It's catchy.
It is definitely more catchy. I love to hear that. Something I love to do is I'll do a hop test on the force plates. Yep. And you look at percentage drop offs there, right? So again, assessing the same thing. I don't, because of the sports that I work in, primarily field sport athletes, team sport athletes, the idea of needing to sustain a 3-minute round, a 25-minute fight, it's a little bit different, right? It almost falls in that alactic, aerobic, intermittent side of things, especially now professional athletes, there's so many timeouts. So all that comes into play too. So I'm less concerned about the drop off. I'm more concerned about the actual quality of it, but I see how it makes sense within the world of MMA. So the third bucket, I think this is the hardest one that I struggle with. And I'm hopeful and optimistic that the world of AI and the advancement in camera systems and machine learning, we're getting better at it. And that is the bucket of movement, right? It's very hard to tell somebody what a good posture is and bad posture is, because it's all relative to your activity in sport, not to double back on the said principle, right? So there's, I think we could probably really get into the weeds on what movement is and should this, range of motion be here or there. But at the end of the day, it tells a story of how this person is just managing gravity. And so I just wanted to, I would be remiss if I didn't ask the question, like, has there been any information that you've come across in your space in the MMA and or relative to the PI, because you've been leaning heavily on them, when it comes to movement, how that is being evaluated, and if there's any standardization or protocols around that?
So they'll do it's almost like so the PI was made, a lot of people from the Olympic Training Center came down. So like Heather Linden is the PT. She's the head of sports medicine at the UFC PI. Gavin Pratt is the head of strength conditioning. He's from the Australian. He's from Australia, but he's from the Australian Strength Conditioning Association. They have their own ways they look at movement. A lot of the times they're going to do passive range of motion on the table, active range of motion on the table. They're going to go through they're going to use the force decks and just check overall strength in the area. But from a movement standpoint, MMA is so unique because there's so many different ways to be a fighter, right? So the PI itself, they have a little movement screen they'll put people through. It's kind of like a variation of FMS. And then my other company, Building a Fighter, like we have our own little version of a movement screen that we'll put people through that I try to pick up on. So like a side-lying shoulder sweep. Is that athlete able to get to the overhead position in a side-lying shoulder sweep without overarching their lumbar spine? Yes or no? If they can't get to that position, that means that they're probably going to be stuck in extension, or they're stuck in the extension compression stability strategy. And instead of using breath to stabilize, they're going to use their back muscles, which we know is inefficient and it's going to cause a fatigue, right? So from a movement quality standpoint, that's really what I'm looking at. But the saying in MMA is there's a bunch of ways to skin a cat, and there are. Like I have a 6'1", 145 pounder who's elite, and I have a 5'7", 145 pounder who's elite. And they do things completely differently. Now, they have different injury risks. Like the taller, skinnier athlete, typically they're going to have a lot more small bone issues. They're going to have a lot more passive structure issues. And then the squattier athletes, we'll say, they typically are going to be more on they're going to have a lot of muscle issue, a lot of muscle tension, and we have to do a lot more muscle work versus like dry needling on. But in and of itself, from a movement perspective, there's no one way to be a fighter. Even though I am going to do a screen on people just to see how they move, that's not going to impact the performance. I'm more or less seeing, is this an injury risk in the future? Potentially. because we know it's not going to correlate immediately to injury risk. But if somebody does a sideline shoulder sweep and they do 10 reps in a side where we're laying on our side, we're moving our hand over the top, or it's a T-spine mobility, and every single rep on both sides, their initiation of movement is through their thoracolumbar junction, right where the T-spine meets the lumbar spine, then they're most likely going to have a lumbar disc issue, especially if we're grappling, because then they're just overextending and just getting stuck there. And they're probably also hyperflexing. So I know that as I'm going to go into the healthcare side of my job and know, hey, that's just another piece of information where when I'm treating somebody, I got to look at this. It might be nerve, not just muscle.
Yeah, I'm always curious where people are at the movement, because it's such a unique gray space. And coming from the physical therapy profession, you know, where quote unquote the movement experts, as you're taught in PT school, and
sure.
in actuality, the school in itself, you know, doesn't really prepare you to evaluate movement at a holistic level. So it's really hard to even say like that is the case. Anyway, it is just a
I will say the one thing that I have seen that, and this isn't data driven, this is from experience driven. Ankle range of motion is one of the biggest correlators to my athletes getting injured. If they're not able, the machine that Hauser brought in with the plantar flexion, the seated calf raise, when they have a massive drop off on one side versus the other, I can almost promise that, and just a seated calf raise on power output, I can almost promise that side is probably going to get injured. And then one of the other things that PI put together, I just remembered, is when they do all their range of motion tests and they do their movement assessments, if there's a greater than 10% disparity between left and right, their data shows that athlete is 70 to 90% more likely to get injured in that area that has the deficiency, as opposed to the area that has the quote unquote proper movement. So even though these screens can't automatically say if somebody's going to get hurt or not, their data is showing that, and they've done it on over 500 athletes now. So I'm going to trust that.
That's fair, right? That gets in. That's probably another can of worms we probably should avoid for part 2 here, because we're going to have to do a part 2 because we haven't even gotten some good stuff here. The idea of asymmetry being normal is, I firmly believe, you're going to be asymmetrical, because the reality is most people have some sort of twist and turn through their hips, through their rib cage at some level. Irregardless of handedness, I think a lot of people assume handedness matters, and you look at the research, not necessarily. Really. So it's anyways, there's this idea of perfect symmetry, although we have 2 eyes and 2 ears and 2 nostrils that are supposed to, we associate a symmetrical face with beauty half the time. You know, you spend any decent amount of time looking at people around the restaurant, you'll notice that a lot of people have one ear a little bit different than the other, or a nostril size a little bit different. And yes, so if you ever catch me at a restaurant and you see me from afar, note that I am casually just glancing over at everybody, just paying attention to how they move and how they look.
Dude, that's the best part of our job. It's made me such a good people watcher. And I'm in an airport, all I'm doing is just looking around. I'm like, oh, what's that guy got going on?
But it's also fast. So it's fast. I'm going to, last point here on the movement side. So run a mentorship group right now. And one of the things that we lead in with during week 1 is just talking about standing posture and just standing functional movements. And because there's a lot of strength coaches that technically don't work on the table, they don't get their hands on them, but it's like, okay, how can you still give them the same tools that someone that works with their hands? And when you've been doing this so long and you're able to do the table test, you're able to do the posture assessment, the movement assessments, inherently, just by watching these things move, facial features, bony landmarks, you start to make these assumptions like, well, if I see this, this, and this, chances are this is going to be your hip range of motion. Chances are this is going to be your shoulder range of motion. So it's fantastic, as you say, like, hey, you can turn into a great people watcher, but it's also a very valuable skill that can actually expedite your assessment and just say, yeah, I can look at you and say, yeah, you probably need to work on X, Y, and Z just by your standing posture and how you're managing gravity. I think it's a very valuable tool. We joke about it's a little bit creepy just watching people all the time, but ultimately people walk through the door and like you go through the assessment and provide all these table measures, and you kind of arrive at your answer 10 steps early just by looking how they stand and walk.
100%. No, it happens. It happens so often in clinic where you just see somebody walking in, and I'm like, I probably already know what this is. I'm gonna do all the tests, but I got the answer already.
Yeah, but right, you do the test for like your own checks and balances, right? We're not saying, hey,
no, yeah, you have to.
we're
do the
not,
tests.
we're not
Yeah.
wizards over here. We're not Gandalf. We're not saying that's the case here, but we are saying, hey, like as just like young clinicians, if you're a young practitioner, young coach, yeah, you got to go through those to understand like your own algorithm. It's almost like, the analogy, I get from a lot of folks, not the analogy, but the question I get is, hey, like what continuing education course should I take? I said, it doesn't matter. Like just go take one that has a system, right? Like you want to go to those courses or this continuing education that have multiple courses to them because you learn their system and process and their algorithm. And it just teaches you like how to think systematically. And then ultimately you're going to go through it and realize, oh, like this fits more with me. I'm going to pull back here and do a little bit of this, and I'm going to refine this. I don't need to do these 3 steps because I can do it in one, right? Like I had a great mentor that could do that. Like he knew what was going on with someone after like 2 or 3 tests, or them just sitting there because he was just paying attention to certain features. And I'm over there sitting in the corner, like trying to measure everything. And he's like, yeah, I knew that 10 minutes ago, but I let you do it because I know you needed to just like see all the pieces, right? So that just comes with clinical experience.
Well, Galpin's got a really good quote that I love on this is you got to be a cook before you can become a chef, right? You have to learn the cookbook before you can start to freestyle a little bit. And you get into problems when you start to freestyle before you know the cookbook. And that's in everything in life. That happens with my fighters all the time, where if they see these guys that are doing some crazy pass in jiu-jitsu and they try to just do it because they saw it in a YouTube video. But I'm like, bro, you don't even know the steps that are leading up to that. You're just going to try to wing that. That makes no sense. But it happens in our job all the time where like you want to be elite. Everybody, I mean, not everybody, but I would say most people want to be elite. But you have to go through it before you get to that level where you get to freestyle a little bit, where you get to figure out your own system. You got to learn other systems before you can figure out your own system.
Well said, man. I like well put. I appreciate that.
I hope that's one of the quotes you put up.
And we can make it one of the ones we will.
I got you, fam.
I'll make sure we tag that. We're going to tag that right in the show notes right now for you. And that will be, there you go. There's your leading quote right there. Awesome.
My quote, which is literally just stolen from Andy Galpin. That's fine. I'm in for this.
Yeah, not a problem. Hey, man, listen, we are running out of time here, and I'm bummed because this conversation went down, like always, man. I knew it was going to happen with you. They go down a path that you just want to explore more. So a part 2 is going to be here, but this being the first one, I want to make sure we touch on these 2 questions that I love to just bring to our community. And that is just understanding how folks can learn from you in the space of the lessons you've learned that they want to implement in their own health and performance journey. And then also just reminding people, and shit, man, I had to be reminded of this this morning myself, just, giving yourself a pat on the back every now and then. So the first question I have is like, how do you define a small win?
I would say it's any small step forward towards a goal. Right. That's point in my head. When I think of a small win, it could be as little as just putting on a smile when it's not necessarily a good day. Right. But it could be as meaningful as that athlete. If I'm working with an athlete, that athlete there's 5 reps. One of those 5 reps was way better than it was last week. I'm going to highlight that. So it's really any meaningful, any small step forward towards a goal is going to be a small win to me.
Man, it's so important because it's with instant gratification nowadays and just the world we live in, like it's very easy not to find those. So I think it's important to make sure we highlight those. And then, dude, listen, like I learned new things about you just even sitting in this conversation, right? There's lessons and experiences that you have had in your career, both as a wrestler and as a provider now in the space. And so not necessarily saying, hey, everyone that's listening to this episode is going to say, yep, Austin's got me jacked up. I want to go get my ass kicked and get choked out and participate in MMA. I doubt maybe there's less than 1% of people that do. If you are, and you're in the Scottsdale area, come see Austin. But if you're not, of all the lessons and experience you've had, right? I think it's important that we share those with everybody because not everybody does, right? And you've had access to a lot of great people, a lot of great resources. So from those experiences and lessons, what do you think is one meaningful way a listener could upgrade their own journey through health and performance?
Well, I mean, honestly, the first thing I would say is try a combat sport, because I think that would increase your health. I think that would give you something, like, even if you're not trying to be a pro fighter, I think that adds a lot of value to a lot of people's lives, even if you just take one jiu-jitsu class, because it teaches you something about yourself you didn't know. It teaches you to get to a different place of, oh, this is hard, but without weights. And it makes you learn something about yourself. But I would say outside of that, meaningful positivity goes a long way. And there's a lot of people that when they say positivity, it's actually just gaslighting, right? They're positive for when you don't need to be positive. It's just being the positive person, right? But highlighting when somebody does something correctly and highlighting even the smallest of wins to keep it on the same trend, and providing that meaningful positivity, we don't get enough of that in life. And if you can do that in any part of life, but especially in the health and fitness setting, that's going to separate you, and that's going to allow you to keep compounding everything just a little bit higher to where you get to your goals over time.
Amen, man. I even needed to hear that, man. I was literally saying to this, I was explaining myself to my therapist this morning. I was like, I've got so much shit on my plate right now between business, life. My house got flooded. There's just so much going on in life. Like, I don't have time to take a minute and pause. And she's like, cool, like, we're going to do it right now. And we're going to say, nice job. And I just appreciate you bring. It's like, I appreciate you bringing that to light, and just to hear you say that as well as someone that's just, listen, you worked in the dog days, you worked in the trenches with these guys. Like, these are some of the most grueling, physically gifted individuals that endure so much. I just think it's important that to hear you say that carries more weight. So thank you, man.
100%. I got you, dude.
Hey, listen, so you are going to come on for part 2 at some point, because we have to get into more of the technical aspects, because you're just a wealth of knowledge, man. There's got so much more that we can really learn from, because I don't think a lot of people necessarily look to the MMA world for health and fitness, but I think there's a lot more to it because of the uniqueness of the sport that actually just applies to general principles. So
I tell everybody, like, if you can learn how to program for, like, if you want to be a coach, you should work with at least 2 to 3 MMA fighters or combat athletes in general. There's so many more variables than a normal sport. So if you can learn how to program for a fighter at an elite level, you can. I work with all sports, but mostly MMA. It takes me about an hour to write a program for an MMA fighter. It might take me 20 minutes just because there's less variables, right? But if you can learn how to work with a fighter, you can work with any person on earth, which is awesome.
So speaking of fighters, you have a wonderful podcast, YouTube, other business. So let's tell us more a little bit about that. So that way, in the interim, before we get you on for part 2, people can come connect with you and learn a little bit more.
Yep. So my in-person clinic's called Warrior Sports Wellness. That's based out of the same facility as Adam here, up in North Scottsdale. And then my online business is called Building a Fighter. So that's going to be a online strength conditioning programming. It's also going to have, we're in Q3 of this year, we're going to have our courses, our level 1 courses coming out. And then we also have a podcast, same name, Building a Fighter, where we get on a bunch of different guests, from dietitians to sports psychs to fighters themselves to skill coaches. And we try to elevate combat sports. And it's not always just combat sports. Sometimes it's just having a good chat and talking about life, right? But it's something to give you value and try to, I'm a big believer in a rising tide lifts all boats. I just want to keep rising and lifting the tide up and up and up so that combat sports gets to the level of all of the other sports, because it's the fastest growing sport the last 15 years, but I think it can grow even faster if we do it the right way.
Man, love that. Well, everyone, please make sure you connect with Austin. He is not only a wealth of knowledge, but also, as you can tell, a gem of a human, and entertaining at the very least. When he leads a conversation with a Super Mario analogy, you know you're in for a good one. So, Austin, I will see you tomorrow, but thank you for joining me for this wonderful episode.
Dude, I appreciate you, and I'll see you tomorrow. Thank you so much for having me on.